Nishma. Then he was speaking that if there's a keser keneged naisa, keser keneged nishma, that's only a result of saying nasa before nishma, but shouldn't it be also a keser that corresponds to the level of saying nasa before nishma? So to explain that, he started saying that there is actually a third keser that's corresponding to nasa before nishma, but that's not placed on the Jewish people's heads. Says the Malachim came down and put two ksarim on the Yidden's head, one keneged Naisim, one keneged Nishma. But really, there are three crowns. That's the three times that the Malachim say Kaddish. The third crown, which is the crown that corresponds to Naisim before Nishma, that is the crown that the Eibishter places on his own head. And to explain that further, he speaks about how there's the level of the crown, the level of Makif, which the crown is what protects and makes the world stand on it. There's a level of the makif of Torah Avodah Chasadim. The same thing. There's the level of the makif that preserves the neshama in the body. And he starts speaking about the whole idea of Seder Ishtalshalos. The whole idea of a chain descent is that the highest most part and the link of the chain is connected to the lowest most link in the chain. Therefore, Atilus is connected with Asiya and vice versa. And then he starts speaking about it in Koiches HaNefesh. So he says in the Koiches HaNefesh, there's all the different Koiches, Machshava Dibramaisa, there's Midas, there is Seichel, there's Koich HaMaskil. So first he explained the relationship and interconnectedness between the Machshava Dibramaisa with Midas, how it's both ways, how both the Machshava Dibramaisa are part of midas and vice versa. How the midas give chayis and machshava d'bramais. Now we're going to go on to speak about, in a similar vein, the relationship in the way of Seder Ishtalshalos between midas and the level of seichel. So we're holding line 10, page Yud Beis, 8th page of the downloads. Similar to this, the midas that are rooted and come from intellect. There's intermingling of the midas in the intellect. Where do we see, in other words, that the midas are located and part of intellect? So that's the idea of when the intellect is in a state of excitement, not an excitement of the heart, it's in the mind. There's like this type of appreciation and excitement of something that is already the midas shebaseichel. So right away he says in the parentheses, why do I call it midas shebaseichel? Why don't I just call it seichel? So he says in the parentheses, line 12, because the level of the idea of excitement is a separate entity than the entire entity of intellect. That's the idea of the intermingling of the emotions in intellect. That when you have the emotions part of intellect, so then you have the excitement in intellect. If there would be no emotions whatsoever located in intellect, then there couldn't be the idea of excitement. That is the relationship of midas and seichel. Then there is the other direction, because we said the links in the chain are such that the uppermost part of the lower link is inside the lower part of the upper link. So it's both things. There's a relationship of the higher level to the lower level. There's a relationship of the lower level to the higher level. What is the relationship of intellect to the midas? So he says in line 14, so too there's the level of the intellect and the emotions. It's midas that the intellect affects vitality and growth in the midas. So the intellect impacts and creates an excitement and a passion and keeps on working on the midas constantly. It's not just the intellect created the midas and then it goes away. The intellect is constantly giving more to the midas. Now he's going to go to the next level. Similar to this in intellect, that its root is from the power of ideas, where the ideas come from. Though the revelation of intellect comes about specifically through toil and effort. One needs to work on bringing out the intellect from the power of where ideas come from, the koyach hamaskil. Now, the fact that you need to work on it very hard, you need to struggle with it. And again, the struggle is true. Even bringing emotions from intellect, there's also a certain amount of effort, but it's not the same effort and it's not the same struggle like it involves coming up with a new idea. Coming up with a new idea, with a new solution, with a novel idea, not solving something or realizing a solution that was already solved. We're talking about completely new idea, bringing a new idea out of the koyach hamaskil. That needs a lot of effort. The fact that it needs a lot of effort indicates how far apart koyach hamaskil and seichel is. The power that brings forth ideas is not an existence of ideas. So it's not like, for example, let's say you have a reservoir of water and you take from that reservoir of water via pipes and so on, and you fill your cup. It's not that way, because it's not that when you're dealing with water in the cup and the water in the reservoir, it's the identical water, except this cup of water is only a piece, might be a small piece, a tiny piece of the amount of water in the reservoir, but it's essentially the same water that was there. Intellect coming from the power of ideas, the source of ideas, the koyach hamaskil, it's not that there is like a whole bunch of ideas on the shelf, and when I come up with a new idea, I pull the new idea out from the shelf of the koyach hamaskil. That's not the way it works. The koyach hamaskil is only a potential state for ideas. An analogy of this would be fire coming out of a flint rock. Fire coming out of a flint rock, it doesn't mean that in the flint rock you have fire. You can break down the flint rock to tiny pieces. You're not going to find fire in there. You're going to drop the flint rock into the ocean. It's not going to weaken its capability of bringing fire forth, because there's no actual fire in the flint rock. And it's also explained to us that that's why it needs a lot of effort, the knocking of the flint rock together to be able to bring the fire out from it. So he says in line 19, and idea coming out from this koyach hamaskil is like yesh me'ayin, which is, by the way, the literal and simple meaning of what we say, v'achachma me'ayin timotzei. A chachma came out of nowhere. An idea comes into my mind, regardless of how much struggle I put in. Whether I was just thinking and then an idea came out of nowhere, or I was just daydreaming and an idea came out of nowhere, or I was struggling and an idea came into my mind, we still say it came out of nowhere. It's like yesh me'ayin. We cannot trace it back because it wasn't located anywhere. It didn't exist as an existence in the koyach hamaskil. Still in all, despite that great distance, that great chasm between koyach hamaskil and seichel, it's still called seder ishtalshlos. We call mokin still in all. Since through effort, at least that's how intellect comes about and comes out of the koyach hamaskil. All that will come out of it is only intellect and not something else. So in other words, that's another indication of the relationship between them. I'm not going to say that from koyach hamaskil, action will come out. Koyach hamaskil and emotion will come out. No, koyach hamaskil is very specific. It's only intellect is going to come out. So that means there is a relationship and a connection between koyach hamaskil and seichel. Therefore, we call it a source for intellect. That's the intermingling of the seichel and the power of intellect. So too, there's the idea of the power of the maskil in the seichel. So there's two things. Again, both directions. there is the seichel and the koach hamaskil. True, it's not like seichel being on a shelf, but there is potential. There is, however it is, it exists in some form, in some subtle way in the koach hamaskil. And then there's also the opposite. There's the koach hamaskil that comes into seichel. So here he's going to explain where an interesting example of where we find koach hamaskil coming down to seichel. He says, "Shehem inyonei haseichel she'einam boim ba'avona v'azbar." There are ideas in intellect that do not come out that in an explained fashion. It's not something that's being explained. For example, Shasik Rav. There was a story in the Gemara about a Rav being challenged about a certain ruling, and he was asked questions that he could not explain to justify his ruling. And still in all, he did not go back on his view. It says Shasik Rav. Rav was quiet. The Tanoim and Amoraim in the Gemara were not shy and reticent of admitting that they were wrong. If they had no answer, the Gemara stated the halacha is not like them, or they themselves explicitly stated that the halacha is not like them, or that they go back on what they said. But in this case, the Gemara has a strange type of idea. It says Rav was quiet, but he didn't go back on on his opinion. How was that possible? Torah is seemingly based on seichel. So he says there was the revelation of koach hamaskil that forced him to see things this way, though it didn't manifest itself in a way that he could explain. Galus, a koach hamaskil, top of page Yud Gimel, because of revelation of the power of the koach hamaskil. I knew this is the difference in koach hamaskil remaining behind the scenes versus koach hamaskil manifesting itself in seichel. I knew it's not the way the koach hamaskil remains concealed in its state of potential. Rather, the way the koach hamaskil becomes revealed. On the other hand, the fact that the Rav could not explain himself, it's still not a revelation of intellect. It wasn't revealed in a way of an intellectual understanding. Rather, it was a revelation of the power that brings forth ideas. So now bringing back to what we said before, we're trying to bring out the idea of Seder Ishtalshelus, that every link in the chain connects to the other link. And because of that, the lowest part of the chain is connected with the highest and vice versa. The same thing in the Ishtalshelus within a person, Ishtalshelus in the word Shalshelis, chain, that's also that way. Then moving line forward, misunderstood. She has in Kol Pratia Madregi should be say the Ishtalshelus and Niskulael, that there's a bond and an association between all the detailed levels of Seder Ishtalshelus that was mentioned earlier. From the power from which ideas issue forth from, until and reaching to the lowest level of thought, speech, and deed. That is all Seder Ishtalshelus within the person. But there is a level within the person that transcends and is outside of Seder Ishtalshelus, outside of this chain link connection. So it says in line 7, to be able to be the drawing down of the powers from the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is completely undefined and non-complex and has no type of definition to it. It's not in the way of a chain order of descent. Rather in a way of something from nothing. And so that is the way it is by a person. So by a person, we just now we brought out two examples, one example for Seder Ishtalshlus, and one example of something from higher than Seder Ishtalshlus. Now he's going to say the same thing, how it is in the worlds, in the spiritual realms. Line 10, with the Gmos Lamailom, similar above, all the detailed levels of the chain order of descent. They have a value and association one to another. They have no comparison whatsoever in to the infinite light of the Eibishter, the emanator. Why is that so that there's no comparison between them? Why is there no link between them? Since it's an infinite light. This infinite light does not allow for the worlds to stand and be and exist. Like it's brought down in Eitz Chaim. Initially, before the creation, the infinite light of Hashem filled all empty space, quote unquote. So in other words, all potential space. Therefore, there was no place, no room for the worlds to be there. Afterwards, Hashem moved and removed his great light, the infinite light, and put it aside. And he drew down a short and thin line. Moving for this understood. There's no comparison and no association of the worlds with the infinite light of the Eibishter, the emanator. Because for the sake of the creation and coming into being of the worlds, there had to be such a type of constriction which is different than all the other tzimtzumim. All the other tzimtzumim throughout Seder Ishtalshlus, or from Chachmat Bina, from Koich HaMaskal to Seichel, from Keser Tatzils, all these other tzimtzumim is in the way of a lessening. It's called miyut ha'oy. This tzimtzum was in the way of removing the light. Why? Because they are so far from each other that to be able to have one, you needed to set aside the other. Since it's an infinite light that's totally beyond the worlds, the coming to being of the worlds from the infinite light, the emanator is not in a way of a chain descent. Rather in a way of something from nothing. Okay. Any questions before we go on?
Is this in general the difference between, for lack of a better term, evolution versus revolution?
I mean, we could always play around with words. I don't know if you want to use those words, it's fine. But this is it's cutesy. It's for somebody that likes to, find nice words. I guess you could use those words if you wanted.
But what is Chassidus itself considered something like this? It's just totally novel and it wasn't the natural progression.
That's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that. There is room for that because we speak about how Pnimis HaTorah is a revelation of Pnimis Atik, which has to do with the higher state of Shtalshlus, perhaps. Okay, further on page Yud Gimel, I think, I say line 26. Hine imi aytkias iron soft shlifnat sims lamail mishaychas loyal mishain nice and walking loyal is though this infinite light of the Eibishter prior to the sims is higher than the association with the worlds, and it doesn't allow room for the worlds. Calm up and still in all. Despite all that we just now said, there comes down from that infinite light of Hashem into the worlds the way they are after the sins. Not just the light of the Kav that's enclosed in the Tzimtzum comes down after the Tzimtzum, which is obvious. That's the way how the whole existence of the world came into being, like we said before, through that Kav. But the Chiddush, what the Rebbe is saying over here is, even from the great circle, meaning that light of the Ein Sof that was pushed aside and placed aside. She'ein la tzimtzum shlita olav, that the tzimtzum has no control over it. The tzimtzum did not constrict that. On the other hand, the Rebbe says, parenthetically, the very fact that it was moved aside means the tzimtzum affected it, it touched it, but it doesn't control it. But it still affects the Oid Sof before the tzimtzum still affects the world. But how does it affect the world and how does it come through? It needs to pass through the tzimtzum process. So that the Oid Sof that's hiding the tzimtzum should be able to come down into the world. It has to come in a way of passing through the tzimtzum. And the emphasis is on the word passing through. It's only in a way of passing through. What is the significance when we say Maiver Chassidus versus Islapshus? When we say something is passing through, that means it's unchanged from its being. Just to give an example in the concept that we talk about in Chassidus. We know that there is neshamas da'atzilus, neshamas da'briya, neshamas da'yitzira, neshamas da'asiyah. What's the difference between them? All of them come from chachma da'atzilus. All of them are chelkel kamemal mamish. So as we see in Perek Beis and Tanya, some neshamas passing through all these worlds remain unchanged, which means that even in the physical world, their experiences and their connection is natzilus type of connection. They have a bitl of yichudiyullah, a bitl of metzias. This is usually the neshama of great tzaddik. Then there's neshamas that pass through these different worlds, and as they came into Bria, they came down and were transformed, and like their atzilus perspectives and connection becomes lost and drowned and overtaken by the Bria perspective. And then the way their Bria comes down toward the Yitzira, and they become in a Yitzira type of mode, and then they come down to Nasiya type of mode. That's called Islapshus. But we say that the Oid Sof prior to sin comes down into the worlds, though it's passing through the tzimtzum, but it's only passing through. The neshama of the tzaddik, for example, that's from Atzilus, cannot jump worlds and come down to the physical world. There's no way a neshama of Atzilus can come down to the physical world. It needs to at least go through the worlds of Yitzira, but it's not affected by it. The same thing, the Oid Sof we're talking about now must go through the tzimtzum, but it still retains its Oid Sof nature in after the tzimtzum as well. Line 4. Therefore, the Oid Sof that's after the tzimtzum is infinite, like the Oid Sof prior to the tzimtzum. As it's known, this is one of the explanations in a concept that's brought down in Kabbalah that says that there is the chain descent of the Keser one from another, meaning that there is a separate line of Seder Ishtalshalos, if you can call it Ishtalshalos, but it's not quite Ishtalshalos for different reasons. There's just the Ishtalshalos of what's called Yosher, the regular Ishtalshalos, the higher levels of clothing, the lower level, etc., Atzilus and Bria, and Yitzira, and so on. And then there is a parallel line of Ishtalshalos, but even though it's running on the same line, it's running on the same rails. But it's the Ishtalshalos of the Kesarim one from another. Keser of Ak has a special connection with Keser Datilas, which has a direct connection with how Malchus becomes a Keser for Bria, etc., etc. So why is that so? Why did the Kesarim have their own direct line to each other in a way like bypassing and ignoring everything else? He says, also the circles after the tzimtzum, that's called the Kesarim, that are like a circle, metaphorically speaking. Though, where did they become revealed from? With the Keser of Atzilus, for example, it becomes revealed from the Kaf. because the Kav is the source of all revelation throughout Seder Shtalshus. Isa Beitz Chaim, like it's brought down the Kabbalah Sefer known as Beitz Chaim, that speaks about Seder Shtalshus, Shakav Nimshach Masagel. It says the Kav comes down and becomes a circle out of it, and then it comes down further, and a further circle comes out of it, and it comes down further, and a further circle comes out of it. So the actual manifestation of these igulim, of these ksarim, are from and out of the Kav, but it's not going through the Kav in a way of islapshus. They're rather connected with the first eagle, the first circle, the Eiris of Shnat Tzimtzum. They're bound up with the great circle that's prior to the Tzimtzum. The fact that there is these igulim, these makifim, these ksarim throughout Seder Shtalshlos is a manifestation of the Eiris of Shalifnei Tzimtzum coming down through the Tzimtzum. But how does it come down through the Tzimtzum? Only in a way of passing through. The Tzimtzum doesn't really change it and make it like worlds. So he said in line 12, that's the general difference between those circles that we said, the makifim, the ksarim that come out of the Kav, and the level of Yosher, the straight light that comes down every single world accordingly, and it's mislabish in a way of mamaluk kalam, and the higher level becomes enclosed in the lower, and so on. The Yosher mislabish bat simsum nishtana muhusi babiskal. The level of Yosher is that light. That it true, it originated before the Tzimtzum, because the Kav, which is the beginning of the Yosher, started from the earnest of Shnat Tzimtzum. But then it became enclosed in the Tzimtzum. It's not passing through the Tzimtzum unaffected by it. It's now changed by the Tzimtzum. And therefore, it comes by all types of divisions. And the Kav, the way it's higher than Natzilus, is different than the way it's Natzilus. And then the Kav, the way it's Natzilus, is different than the way it is in Bia, and so on. But as opposed to, that's all Yosher. But the Igulim, but when you talk about the levels of the Makifim, the levels of Ksarim, the circles, so then that's the light that passes through the Tzimtzum. And the light was not changed in its very being. Because the light was not changed in its very being, therefore, therefore, also down here below, even though it's located now in Atzilus or lower than Atzilus, but it's the Makif that's located in lower than Atzilus. It's the Igulim that's located. It's the Keser that's located. So it's really a manifestation of the Ein Sof that's higher than the Chalkos, higher than the Tzimtzum, is being manifest over here. And he's going to give a very interesting mashal soon for this concerning water, that even when you separate water, water is essentially the same and unchanged, whether it's separated, whether it's located here, located there. Water is water. It's not any different. The same thing is going to bring an example for the Ein Sof. The way it's that very Ein Sof, the way it is before the Tzimtzum, that very Ein Sof is manifest in a, perhaps to put it in the, for lack of a better term, in a smaller version in after the Tzimtzum. But we'll see tomorrow as it goes on to the Mishalim and the difference between Seder Shtalshlos and how things change in a way of Yosher from one level to another level versus the level of the Makifim, the Igulim, how they're connected with each other and how they are unchanged from the Ein Sof Shlifnei Tzimtzum. Any questions?